Hello and welcome. I'm going to be trying out a new format, which is basically I choose a topic each week, I learn about it, and for the next 6 weeks, the overarching themes of these topics is going to be understanding the world on a grand scale, having a better understanding of how the world currently works. Now, for this first week, I'm trying to understand the historical context. What, for instance, causes these massive geopolitical trends that we see in the last 100 years? Further, I would like to answer, because it feels like, especially in the last year with COVID, or Kobe Bryant dying, or the Australian bushfires, or the election of Joseph Biden, that life seems really crazy at the moment. And I'm wondering whether it's maybe always been this crazy. And I'm trying to explore that for this week. Now, for this week, I've tried to find 4 different trends or movements of the last 100 years. And the 4 different movements that I'm looking at are progressivism, which is the trend of the women's suffrage movement or Black Lives Matter. The development of technology is another movement that is still very prominent today, and so is the creation of pacts and treaties, which really rose to prominence after World War II, which we'll look more at. Lastly, the decolonization, which in the last 100 years has been a great trend, which we'll dive more into later. So we start off at World War II. To be specific, at the end of World War II. And now World War II had impacts on every single one of these movements. In progressivism, while all the men were out fighting in the Great War, the women had taken up factory jobs and had taken control of the home, which led to massive increases in women's rights. World War II also brought many great technologies with it. For instance, flights, nuclear energy, the starting points of computing, and medicine. Thirdly, most European nations suffered greatly in World War II. And to prevent war and to stave off Russia, agreements had to be made between countries. And this is really a trend that's continued into today. And lastly, a weakened Europe could no longer maintain its colonies. So this is all effects of World War II. And we're going to be diving, firstly, into progressivism. Now, why did progress become a trend? Why do we still see it today? And the research that I've done point to 3 different things. Firstly, in today's society, a very different type of labor is required comparatively to 500 years ago. We need a lot smarter people to do accounting and to manage all the systems that we build. Now, and smarter people are harder to oppress. That's just how that is. Because they now have leverage. They are the leverage themselves. Secondly, the wars. Another reason why progress ensued World War II was that women needed to work more in technical fields. And as stated previously, the women controlled the house. And this led to them feeling a greater sense of control and responsibility, which, led to the third point, which is women's protests, which led, for instance, to the 19th Amendment in America, which is the right for women to vote. Next, the civil rights movement and the suffrage movement really helped each other out by asking the question, if a woman is equal to a man and a black woman is equal to a man, then why aren't black people equal? And this really compounded, as you'll see maybe in the following slides. And this is more a basic rundown of how this went. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, which we mentioned previously. 35 years later, this was a while later, the suffrage, the civil rights movement properly started, with Rosa Parks sitting in the bus and not letting a white man sit where she wanted to sit, which really made from 55 to 60 a very strong civil rights movement, which made the Civil Rights Act in 64 and the Affordable Housing Act and the Roe versus Wade, which was basically the right for women to have abortions. So it all really compounded together. So that was the first movement. And you still see it today. The second movement, or the second trend, which is technology. The Spanish flu in 1918 killed more than 50 million people who were returning, mainly due to the fact that a lot of people were returning from World War I. That's 50 million people. Smallpox, since the 1500s, 1400, whatever, caused 300 to 500 million deaths. While with our new technology, Corona within a year has a vaccine, and up until this point only 2.1 million people have died, even though we live in a much more connected world, and a world where you have 5 times as many people as there were in 1900. 1900. So, why did we see this trend towards a massive increase in technology? And the first reason for this is the mass production of high-tech goods. And this is really related to both electricity and war tech, because the military research that was conducted in World War II and after for the Cold War provided massive advances in communication tech, computing, and medicine, which could be mass produced then, and electricity further benefited this. They're all working together to really create a boom. Lastly, the more people you have alive, the more people can work and that can learn and can develop. And it's really remarkable. Fleming in 1942 first developed antibiotics, and this led to a 12 to 15% increase of soldiers surviving in World War II. This was absolutely foundational. And you see it after World War II. From 45, the baby boomer started, which is the biggest population growth that America ever saw. And it's because of these advances in medicines, as well as these vaccinations for smallpox and whooping cough, which were annually killing close to 6 million people. So, movement 3. Now there's 4 main reasons why after World War II, the number of treaties and pacts increased. Firstly, after World War II, they didn't immediately want to jump into another world war. France and England extended an olive branch, and the losers, Germany, Italy, and the other Axis powers accepted. Which has led to the stable Europe that we know today, for instance. And this really extends across all in all countries. You see the same trend happening. The looming Cold War. This influence, and we'll go more into specific treaties in a little bit, but the strong Soviet Union, which was still occupying Central Asia and most of Eastern Europe, was a real threat to the United States, who wanted to encourage capitalism, which meant that the USA had to enter a lot of different pacts with the currently war-tired and exhausted and poor and debt-ridden European nations, which led to very important pacts and treaties. Now, the last 2 are really still important today and still are massive drivers for why pacts and treaties are created. The first is the atomic age. And you'll see why this is such an important thing later, but it's mainly because if you're fighting someone with an atom bomb, you can only push them so far until you catch a nuke. And the second is the fall of Rome. Rome fell because it was so large that divisions were created within it. So, and the lesson there is that pacts and treaties are a way of maintaining incredible power, while not being so large that you are very subject to internal division. Now, here are a couple of examples of this, and you can see these are heavily inspired by World War II. Now, firstly, the Paris Peace Treaty, which was made after World War II, and was just basically war reparations. And this was really the start of the 1957 agreement, Treaty of Rome, which formed the European Economic Area. NATO. This is another reason that that nuclear weapons changed the game so much. NATO has an agreement of 30 nations, which have a policy of one for all and all for one. If one country who signed the NATO agreement gets attacked, all of them are attacked. And since a lot of these countries within the NATO have nuclear weapons, that's not people you want to attack. And lastly, it's just an important treaty that was signed, or less of a treaty, more of an agreement. NARA, the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The height of the Cold War is upon us. The USA has 24,000 nuclear weapons pointed at Russia, and Russia has some 4,000 pointed back. Russia plants weapons of mass destruction in Cuba, and the US in Turkey. there was a de-escalation of both the state heads, treaties, if you want it like that, in order to stop the possibility of a outright nuclear war, which is just an example of a very important treaty. Now, we head into the next section, which I think really highlights the massive difference that 100 years can make. And we can sort of look at the geopolitical trends quite clearly because we can see it on a map. Now, this is the world in the 1900s. You can see the Russian Empire still controls very much Central Asia and most of Eastern Europe. The Chinese Empire controls Mongolia. And interestingly, this little thing here controls Newfoundland, swaths of Africa, India, Afghanistan, and Australia and New Zealand. We'll highlight this further, but you can see within this the Middle Eastern Africa circle is not how we know it today. The UK no longer owns all of those nations in Africa. Neither do the Germans, or in southwestern Africa, France is no longer the dominant leader. And this is really due to the Second World War, mainly because all of these European nations, the UK, were very debt-ridden and could no longer control their territories. Same with Germany and same with France. This led to all of these gaining independence. And once that became the staple, more and more countries sought their independence. And these are sort of the main examples of that. India. In 1947, India gained independence, which was a bloody massacre, but just because England divided them into Pakistan and India. Next, Oceania, Australia, and New Zealand in the early 1900s. Africa, as you saw, is a completely different place now. And this mostly happened 5 years after World War II. And it was because European powers were debt-ridden and because the European powers had armed these African nations so they could take the fight for them. Lastly, or second to lastly, the fall of the Soviet Union left most of Central Asia and European with its independence. And you can see this here. You have Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, all countries which are now free, as well as, large swaths of Europe. And lastly, the Philippines gained independence and Indonesia gained independence. And now the reason that there was quite a lot of examples there is to highlight these four movements. And now in today's society, progressivism has really it's continued. Now most people are equal, but if you still look at, of course, the Middle East and women's rights, or realistically China and women's rights, it still continues there. Further, the trend of technology increasing has only amplified, and this is due to just globalization really picking up. And the internet. It's just an incredible tool. Next, treaties and pacts. This has become the predominant way, since it's much harder to wage war against other countries with nuclear weapons, to exert power. Trade pacts are incredibly powerful. If you think about the Iranian nuclear deal, That's why that's such a big deal, because Iran has entered treaties and pacts with other countries, which they're getting fucked over by if they produce nuclear weapons. That was a simplification, but whatever. And lastly, decolonization. Interestingly, this has predominantly stopped. And this because most of the land on the world is taken, and you can't pick a fight without angering some very powerful people. Boop. Summary. The world is constantly changing. Yep. There are 4 different movements that have predominantly shaped the 20th century. Those are technology, decolonization, progressivism, pacts and treaties. And lastly, technology and treaties and pacts have further increased in their relevance, and I'm going to be looking at those in the next coming weeks. Thanks. So the lesson learned is here. This was way too large of a topic to really do one video on, but I sort of wanted to move on to the next ones anyway. So that's a lesson learned. I'm gonna try and just combine it more. Just because four different movements are sort of hard to get a narrative arc into. Next, the only constant in the world is change, and since the mortality rate from the 1900s has decreased by 52%, I'm really glad that I'm living in the world today and not the world of yesterday. Alright, thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.